Hi, everybody. This is Lauren and Tom. I didn't know who should start, but this is Lauren and Tom. Welcome. Go ahead, Lauren.
Well, welcome, Rudy, to everybody to the Yoga Philosophy Discussion Study Group coming to you from the Yoga Center of Chico, California. Tom and Lauren here doing our recording from the book that we're studying now, which is Light on Life by BKS Iyengar. Thank you, Tom. And that's what it looks like. A lot of people have it in their possession, but they've never read it. We're giving you a good reason why you should crack open this book and read it. Now, it turns out that we are on chapter 5, which is discussing the fourth kosha. We're in the middle of the book, or a little past the middle of the book. But you're welcome to join us at any time. We record these so they're available at any time on the Yoga Center Chico's YouTube site. What's it called? Channel. We also meet live at the Yoga Center Chico the fourth Thursday of every month for the live discussion, which we don't record. And so the discussion is open and free, but at the same time, we open a Zoom channel. All of the information on how to contact us and the link to the Zoom channel for the fourth Thursday of every month, 5:30 Pacific time, is on the YCC website. You just type in YCC, go to the website, go to events, and you'll see all the links there. Well, with that, we're going to record now. I'll start off and then Tom will fill in. The second half of chapter 5, talking about the Vijnana Maya kosha. Now, the feedback I've gotten from people is they want a little bit more of a framework for this particular chapter. So let me set the stage by saying, if you look back to the previous chapter, well, if you look back to the beginning of the book, what Mr. Iyengar says is he's taking us on the yoga journey, down the yoga path, deeper and deeper inside. And somewhere along the line, we go through what's a lot of times referred to as a hinge, where we go over the hinge from the physical world into the mental world. This is where we're at now. This is what we're talking about now. The previous chapter talked about how in yoga world, going way back, the people that studied this for a living came up with what we now call a model for a way to think about and examine and use our mind. So in English, we say mind, and we just kind of like say mind and use that term. And we don't really think about what we're talking about. But in yoga world, they break it up into, I'll say 4 parts, the way I like to describe it. Is your mind is your manas, which is your recording mind, and it's also your memory. And this is out of chapter 4, kosha number 3. Your mana is your recording mind. The second one is your ahamkara, which is your ego. The third is your buddhi, buddhi, which is your intelligence. So in the previous chapter, he mainly focused on the manas and the ahamkara. And he said in that previous chapter, in the next chapter, we're going to really get into in detail about the intelligence. So this chapter is integrating everything to date. It's integrating the 8 limbs of yoga. It's the practices of the 8 limbs of yoga. It's integrating the physical body, the energy body, the mind, and now we're into the intelligence. So there's a whole chapter here just on intelligence. So the first thing in terms of the framework to keep in mind is that that's what we're examining in great detail. But just like in asana practice, you might have an instructor say, put your consciousness on the bottom of your left big toe. On the bottom of your left big toe, very specific. And then we go on to your entire body and you can examine that in asana practice. We're doing the same thing. We're using the discipline we developed in our asana practice to do that with our material, quick mind, particularly the intelligence. Now, I don't have the time here to go into all the great details of how Inger describes intelligence, and this is Inger speaking today to us in, fortunately for us, plain English, but it's based on the Yoga Sutras, which are based on the Upanishad. So the roots of all of this information go deep and way back and have been time tested. And he's serving it to us in a friendly, accessible manner. It helps in the big picture to look at the title, the subtitles in this chapter. I think it's, if people want a framework, I would suggest that's a good place to go, because the subtitles really say a lot. In the first part of the chapter, which we studied in December, the subtitles, let's see here, I lost track of loading. Here we go.
Wisdom, the intellectual
Yes.
body.
Go ahead.
The chapter 5, wisdom title, subtitles,
Yep.
the intellectual body.
And so the subsets of the first half of the chapter, there's the introduction, and then examining intelligence. He talks about the lens of consciousness, transforming the mind, insight, intuition. So those were the topics talking about intelligence and consciousness in the first half of this chapter. So we have the model of the mind, and we start looking at insight, wisdom, and how we can think about the intelligence and consciousness as like a lens that looks that where the light goes inward and it also goes outward. These are concepts tools that we use to try to understand, and more importantly, to try to practice what is going on and what is being described in this chapter. So today, the second half of the chapter, we're going to go even deeper into this. This is assuming that in the first half of the chapter, people have an understanding of not only the manas, the ahamkara, and the buddhi. I mentioned the fourth one, so pop quiz. If you're paying attention, what would the fourth one be? I like to label the consciousness, the mind's eye, as like a fourth one, because Iyengar really distinguishes between intelligence as part of the mind model and your consciousness, which is always with you. It's always there. So here we go. The first place to start that you might want to start is the title of the chapter, like Tom said, is the Vijnanamaya Kosha. And when you look up the word Vijnana, it generally is translated as consciousness, discernment, intelligence. So we're talking about the layer inside in our mind, which specifically is the intelligent layer. And the jumping off place into this second half, I think, is in page 165, or at least it's a convenient, nice jumping off place from page 165, where he says, it is through this practice, that the scattered mind is brought to a focal point. That kind of says it all. It's a lot of where we're headed is into the focal point, which we're going to talk about later in terms of dharana and dhyana, which is part of this chapter. And he says, this is a training regime that moves us towards direct perception. I had to pick one or two sentences that said it all. Those are nice ones to pick. There's plenty of others to pick from. And then he goes on to talk about intelligence. We are now developing, the intelligence we're now developing depends on an emotional and moral maturity, the ability to value truth and respect ethical conduct, the capacity to feel love in its more universal sense as compassion. Self-knowledge allows us, and the self-knowledge he talks about is the consciousness' ability to be self-reflective. It's developing the ability to witness ourselves, to be able to see ourselves. It's that self-study that's talked about in the Niyama. I think it's the Niyamas is a self-study. Tom can correct me if I'm wrong on that
No, that's
particular.
that's Svadhyaya. You're correct.
Yeah, so he says we can use yoga to discriminate between what truly is inevitable and what we can determine. And what he's getting at there, and I think what he's doing is encouraging us to realize that we can use our yoga practice, all the 8 limbs of yoga. We're going to be talking up to through 7 to discriminate and change our behavior and make clear, conscious decisions as we go forward in our life. That's the promise, and that's the practice. It's more than a promise. It's if you practice it, you can get there. And that's another thing I want to say. I started off with in the live group is if you think that this chapter is too esoteric and beyond you, I would invite you to take a look at the practices. They're from this chapter, and there's a lot of practical things we can do to move ourselves from the theoretical knowledge to actually doing this stuff in everyday life. Okay, so moving along. He talks about power, power and wisdom to make the freedom journey. And in Sanskrit, power is Shakti. And this is really interesting because he talks about, let's see, 1, 2, 4 types of power. The first 3 we need to be aware of and identify as we move to the 4th. So there's the healthy body. This is going back to the Annamaya Kosha, the healthy body, the power of a healthy body. Added to the prana shakti, the power of pranic energy. Added into the jnana power, the prana shakti, the power of awareness. Coming out of the Manamaya Kosha, the power of consciousness. And you align those powers, and that helps you approach the Atma Sakti, the power of the soul. That's what we're talking about today. It's aligning our powers to be able to get next to the soul. That's where we're going to end up. And moving on to page 172, he says, it is by the will of awareness to penetrate that intelligence is able to move into and occupy the darkest recesses of our being. And we use these powers to fill the gaps that we have in our knowledge through this self-study. It is the intuitive insight that, and we talked about intuition in chapter in the previous quotient, the previous chapter. It's the intuitive insight that sees because it sees, knows because it knows, and acts immediately and spontaneously because the 3 Shaktis have aligned and merged within the light emitted by the soul. So these are not just Sanskrit terms or theoretical terms. These are things that we feel in our body, or we feel in our mind, or we're aware, we're putting a consciousness on in our mind. And I wanted to say, if you recall, if everybody has told me, everybody I've talked to about this stuff, has told me they have had in their life flashes of insight where we can see the combined powers of these 3 Shaktis. And so one of the practices that I'm going to put forth in the list is go back and think, or look forward as you go through life into the future, of times when you had those flashes of insight. And to the best you can recall, see, were things aligned? Why do you think you had that? Or just make a note of what happened and watch for those to happen in the future. Now, we come to a part in this chapter where he's built up all of the positive aspects and all the positive things that we can, you might say, reap from the practice of putting our consciousness on our intelligence and understanding our intelligence and its ability to make good decisions. So he builds us up to this point, this crescendo, and then he has a section called the impurities of intelligence. It's a big, giant warning. It roughly aligns with the third pada in the sutras, where they talk about all these powers, but warn against getting stuck on those powers and crashing and burning. My language, crashing and burning. Pride is the first one he mentions, and it's not necessarily a big long list, but what he does is he describes what can happen when you climb up the learning curve and then you sort of stall out, like you're in an airplane, you sort of stall out, you get too full of the powers, you get too looking down on people that maybe aren't where you're at, and you're in my opinion, working exactly in the opposite direction the yogi should work. It gives us a big giant warning here. And let me just paraphrase some of the things he talks about. Summary to date, the role of the first of the seven limbs of yoga and their roles. He gives that. Pratyahara, he says, is the stage at which we reverse the current from the mind going out to the senses as the world pings our senses, reverse that current of a flow of energy so we can bend the energy, the mind's energy back to ourselves and use the power of intelligence, study the intelligence and use the power of intelligence. We cannot use the power of intelligence, in other words, if our energy and our mind is always reacting to the things that ping us in our world. TVs that are on, radios that are on, useless, I don't know, cluttered rooms is another one. So the practice of pratyahara comes into play here, where we can reverse that flow of energy. And he mentions this on page 176. It's a way to make sure that you have the energy flowing in the right way instead of out in the impurities. Page 177, he goes on to say, subversion in the intelligence. The impurities are hard to detect. The ego aids and abets them, and they're all flaws of the intelligence. So here's where the ego comes in. It really pays to keep an eye on the ego. The ego can dominate the conversation in your head. It can suppress the intelligence. And there may be times where you have to put the ego in its place, give the intelligence the floor to speak. And it takes work and practice to be able to hear the difference between the two, and to, just like you can feel maybe the energy moving different places in your body, you can make the floor open for the intelligence to predominate. He says, get rid of impurities of the intelligence with the help of conscience. Conscience, conscience. So there's a really interesting discussion he goes through here where he talks about the conscience lies right next to the soul. And the conscience is the thing that lies next to the soul that is like God whispering you in your ear, whether you did the right thing or not. Or sometimes it's telling you to do this because it is right, but it's extremely hard to do in it. And it's hard to follow through and actually do the right thing. Also, we all do the wrong thing sometimes. And the conscience, if we tune in with our intelligence and pay attention and listen, the conscience will tell us, hey, what you did over there 10 minutes ago, that wasn't too cool. That wasn't right. And you'll know because it hurts inside. It's a visceral feeling that you'll get. There's a joke in my family where somebody wakes up in the morning and, I didn't get much sleep last night, or I didn't get very good sleep last night. The joke is, oh, what's the matter? Your conscience bothering you? Couldn't sleep? Another way of looking at it. In the literature of death and dying, there are people that cannot die because their conscience is telling them, you have to do right by this situation before you're going to be let go. That's how powerful it is. So it's something to become aware of, something to put your consciousness on and start learning about this tool. It's in addition to the manas, ahamkar, the buddhi, and the consciousness. It's another tool as we go inward through the koshas. It sits right before the soul. Let's see here. And there was a, he had a nice way of talking about it. I can't find it right this minute. So moving right along. Okay. Oh, here it is. I have it in my notes. Conscience, he says, Iyengar says, conscience, when it is flawless, well, this is a point of discussion, a philosophical point of discussion that we're going to pick up next time. When it's flawless, is the voice of our soul whispering in our ear. It's the good angel sitting on your shoulder, some people like to say. Even a painful conscience is a privilege, as it is proof that God is talking to us. And the question came up in the discussion, how do we know we're going in the right direction when we listen to our conscience? And what Iyengar says here at the end of the conscience section is your conscience will always move you towards unity. And we're talking about the unity that you find, the cosmic unity in the universe. Okay, Dharana and Dhyana, the two limbs of yoga that are encompassed in this chapter. Dharana, he says it's a technique for purifying the intelligence versus Dhyana, a technique for purifying the ego. So in the big picture framework, something that you might want to keep in mind. Tom and I could probably talk forever how meditation in yoga world is very different from the popular concept of meditation, which is more mindfulness. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here going into that one. I am going to talk about what is meditation in yoga world. So true concentration comes out of pratyahara practice, turning the senses inward, reversing that flow of energy, and then bringing your consciousness to a single point of concentration. So, for example, if you're turning your senses inward by closing your eyes, you might ask yourself, well, where's my consciousness right now and what is it doing? Are my eyes closed? But is my consciousness still flipping around? Or can I bring my sight behind my closed eyes to a single point or spot is more likely how to describe it, and focus my consciousness on that. It's an exercise you can do pretty much anywhere, anytime, any place, any day. And I will list that in the exercises. So it's a training regime, as he says. It's a practice to move from pranayama to pratyahara to dharana, single pointed concentration or single mindedness. And it's working against the outward flow that we tend to live in everyday life. So it takes a lot of energy. It's hard to do. It's harder to do than asana practice in some ways. And you can combine it with asana practice, at least in my opinion. Okay, let's see what else I want to say about dharana. Oh, okay, I thought this was interesting. True concentration is an unbroken thread, and he describes an unbroken thread of awareness. Just what I was saying. The chattering mind is a lot of little distracting waves. Concentration is like one big integrated wave that's passing through. It's a sustained flow of concentration. It begs the question, what are you concentrating on? We don't have time to go into that, but you can pick something and see if you can't sustain your flow of consciousness on just one item and not have the monkey mind interfere. He gives a great example of how you can integrate this in with your asana practice, where Once you get yourself all situated in the particular pose that you pick, to then take all the little discrete parts and shift your consciousness to the entire body and try to then see yourself as one complete whole. It's this moving towards unity that he's talked about throughout the whole book. And then your dharana practice, as it extends, it gets longer and longer and longer, becomes a dhyana practice. And Tom can jump in here in a second to talk about this, because dhyana happens out of the dharana practice. You can't just leapfrog to dhyana. I mean, you can try, knock yourself out, but you work through the limbs of yoga to get there. And having the single pointed concentration that is extensive and is egoless is where you end up in your dhyana practice. It's the practice to, I'll say, neutralize. You don't eliminate the ego. You don't kill the ego. You neutralize it. It's still there when you need it. It's meditation. It's deep tranquility. You can imagine yourself in dhyana by thinking about silence and stillness. And a practice that can go along with this or help with this is practicing observing and being the witness of the bottom of your exhale. And there's a video that we have on the YCC YouTube channel called Apajapa, which helps you to experience that. With that, I think that was pretty much it. Yeah, that's probably it in the time that we have. Let me turn it over to Tom to fill in any gaps, correct anything that I might have said, and add to his thoughts on Dharana, Dhyana, the other part of the chapter. Tom?
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Good job. Yeah, so it's difficult to think of these three. Well, you really shouldn't think of these three limbs of yoga separately from one another, dharana and dhyana samadhi. When these three elements start to work together, it's called something called samyama yoga. So, but how do they work? Okay, so dharana is the idea of focusing your attention on a single object. And that is, according to classical yoga and the Iyengar, that is not meditation, that is simply concentration. And then one eventually gets to the state of they're meditating on something and suddenly the mind quiets down completely and there's no thoughts. That silence that Lauren was talking about. But the real culmination of all of this is kaivalya, or emancipation, or whatever you want to call it, samadhi. It's when the object of meditation or concentration and the observer integrate into a single energetic unit. So I am no longer meditating on an Om sign. I am the Om sign. Or I'm not only meditating or concentrating on my breath, I feel like I'm integrated with the breath. And it's a whole different level of integration and union, right? We're back to the idea of yoga, the union of your object of meditation with the meditator or the concentrator. And that then, and eventually, one would like to penetrate down into the body. So then that what you integrate with, the thing that you become one with is the inner self, the soul, that inner peace. So this dharana, dhyana, samadhi have a direction and a goal, and the goal is self-realization, and it's a long, hard process. And this is what we're doing, though. So that's how I think of these last three limbs of yoga. Go ahead,
Great.
Lauren.
And that's a great jumping off point for the next chapter where we're going to discuss this in great detail. I forgot to point out that talking about the going to the bottom of the exhale, well, I call it going to the bottom of the exhale, and the value of that. This also comes from the Yoga Sutras, and in fact, if you're interested, it's Yoga Sutra 2-50 through 2-55, very end of the second chapter or the second pada. So if you want to look at the roots of that, that's a good place to look. And I think,
Just a little
let's
note
see
on that,
here.
Lauren. I
Yeah.
think what he's referring to there is a breath retention at the end of the exhalation.
Yes.
That time, and you'd be surprised if you guys practice it how long you can really hold your breath with no air in there or very little air in there. And it's sort of a special time when the consciousness is really closed down and there's a real internal quiet. So it's a worthy practice. I teach it if you're interested in learning it. A lot of times I teach it in my pranayama classes the fourth week of every month at YCC.
I
So
teach it also, and that's a part of the way I do it is an Apa Japa practice. It is the one time that you can be quiet and still and not in any kind of duality. Because even if you're, say, in Shavasana, you're still breathing. You're still in a dualistic world, breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. But at the bottom of the exhale, when you are witnessing what goes down there, or the retention at the bottom of the exhale, it there's something magical about that, and it comes up in the sutras. It's a point that has come to us through the history of yoga, and it's definitely worth looking at. I highly recommend it. It's always with you, and it's always accessible once you learn it. With that, then, Tom, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you,
sounds
everybody who
good.
might be watching this.
Okay, thanks a lot, everybody.
We'll
Bye
see you
bye.
next time.